Hello, lovely people. My name is Anya. I'm here delivering my third video in 4 months, which is unprecedented speed for me. I hope you're impressed. And I'm also quite sick and I don't feel great, so I would appreciate some sympathy subscriptions. So, the topic of today's video is how self-hatred can be a symptom of narcissism. We tend to think of narcissists as very puffed up, kind of loud, arrogant people. And that's the type of narcissism called overt or grandiose narcissism. But there's also another type called covert or vulnerable narcissism. And this type of person can actually present as very shy and self-critical. In a psych journal published by Cambridge University Press, Dr. Jessica Yackley describes these two types like this. Overt narcissists may appear arrogant, pretentious, dominant, self-assured, exhibitionist, or aggressive. Whereas covert narcissists may present as overly sensitive, insecure, defensive, and anxious about an underlying sense of shame and inadequacy. I think a simple way of looking at it is just this. Whether you like yourself too much or you hate yourself too much, at the end of the day, what you're doing really is just thinking about yourself too much. I'm sure you know this, but the term narcissism comes from the Greek myth of Narcissus. And Narcissus was this very hot young man who one day caught his own reflection in a lake and became absolutely transfixed and ended up sort of wasting away at the side of the lake, staring at himself. But what if he wasn't admiring himself? What if he was obsessing over enlarged pores, or wrinkles, or receding gums? So to illustrate this idea, I'm going to be using a story from 1998 called The Depressed Person. It's by David Foster Wallace of The Terrible Bandanas and Verbose Genius. The title of the story makes it sound like this is a story about depression, which it is to a degree, but mainly it's about the habits and etiology of self-obsession. The protagonist of the story, the depressed person, we never actually learn her real name. She certainly thinks she's depressed. I mean, it's basically her identity. But as the story goes on, it becomes clear that there's actually a lot more going on. The former acquaintances and classmates who composed her support system often told the depressed person that they just wished she could be a little less hard on herself, to which the depressed person responded by bursting involuntarily into tears and telling them that she knew all too well that she was one of those dreaded types of everyone's grim acquaintance who call at inconvenient times and just go on and on about themselves. And, the reason, this story with me really hard. I feel personally offended by it because everything I loathe about this frankly miserable slug of a woman is what I hated about myself when I was in my early 20s, when I was way more depressed and more narcissistic than I am now. But I do realize the irony of making all of this about myself. So before we go on, though, I have to say one thing. David Foster Wallace was brilliant. He was also an abuser. He dated the absolutely genius writer and poet and memoirist Mary Carr and stalked her, kicked her, followed her kid home from school, ambushed her AA meetings. These are biographical facts, and they're not relevant to my analysis of his story. But I still think it's just important to have that said. Oh, and one more thing. So when I say that hating yourself is narcissistic, I am not implying that everyone who dislikes themselves is a clinical personality disordered narcissist, right? Narcissism is a spectrum, and a degree of narcissism is actually absolutely necessary and healthy. And most of us are super far from the end of the spectrum where the people with narcissistic personality disorder live. So we can all just relax, okay? Okay. Brief interviews with hideous men. You gotta give him credit. Truly the king of titles. The story begins like this. The depressed person was in terrible and unceasing emotional pain, and the impossibility of sharing or articulating this pain was itself a component of the pain and a contributing factor in its essential horror. Some readers and reviewers see this story as a genuine attempt on Wallace's part to make us understand what depression feels like. Wallace is going to do the best he can to communicate that pain and horror. We don't want to be her, but would agree to hug her if that would help ease the pain. I would rather eat nails than hug this woman. I do not think this is about making us feel her pain. Instead, what it does is it takes her misery and questions it. Is all of this really coming from depression, or is it coming from narcissism? By the way, I will be posting all of my favorite books and movies and whatnot about depression and narcissism on my Patreon. Also, if you become a patron, you get your name in the end credits of every video, if you want that, of course. Come be a patron. The depressed person is sad. She's miserable, in fact, but she's very grandiose about this misery. Grandiosity is the sort of pomp and arrogance that is the easiest way, really, to recognize a person with above average narcissism in the wild. And she has it. I mean, even that first line, terrible and unceasing emotional pain. And just to clarify, the story is written in third person, but it's close third person, so we can assume that this is the depressed person's terminology and wording. Then in the next paragraph, it turns out that she was incredibly traumatized in her childhood when her divorced parents couldn't decide which of them was supposed to pay for her braces. And divorce is really, really hard on the kid, but she describes this fight as the venomous struggle over the cost of her orthodonture, and that struggle's legacy of emotional pain for her. Again, it sounds like someone who takes themselves quite seriously. It also doesn't help her case that she's incredibly privileged. Eventually, she gets the braces and summer camp, private school, horse riding lessons, therapy, and a nose job. So where more overt narcissists could say or could clearly imply that they're the hottest or the smartest or the most powerful, the depressed person's grandiosity is in the fact that she thinks she is the most miserable. Her pain is the number one pain in the world. And this narcissism is covert. She sort of brandishes this slogan, the depressed person, like it's a shield. Her therapist even suggests at one point that her mood disorder might be a defense mechanism. And this is what's important to understand about the covert narcissist versus the overt narcissist. The overt narcissist is outward bravado and arrogance. Inwardly, they're quite vulnerable. The covert narcissist is outwardly very vulnerable and fragile, but inside they actually have the classic narcissistic sense of self-importance. Dr. Yackley describes this difference like this. In the case of grandiose or overt narcissists, their grandiosity may conceal an underlying sense of impotence, shame, and inadequacy, whereas in the covert or vulnerable narcissist, manifest shyness and reticence may shield a secret sense of importance. The depressed person spends her days calling her friends to talk about her depression and seeing her therapist. She criticizes herself ruthlessly. She calls herself self-consumed, a bottomless emotional vacuum sponge, and a whiny, spoiled, self-involved, snaggle-toothed, pig-nosed, fat-thighed, pathetic shit-eater. But the thing is, if you criticize yourself like this to friends, they're kind of obligated to compliment you, or to at least say that that's not true. I'm ugly. You're hot. I'm stupid. Oh my God, of course you're not stupid. The depressed person's therapist actually suggests that this constant self-criticism is an attempt to protect oneself against the possibility of a negative judgment by making it clear that one was already judging oneself far more negatively than any listener could have the heart to. So you could argue that by complaining about herself compulsively to her friends, the depressed person is actually seeking out constant external validation. The reason narcissism demands constant external validation is because the narcissistic personality's sense of self is shaped pretty much exclusively by what the world reflects back to them about themselves. Just like Narcissus staring at his reflection. There's nothing wrong with needing external validation. What matters is just how much of it you need. And it's clear that the depressed person seeks it out compulsively. Not only that, but she's manipulative about how she gets it. She would implore each supportive friend to tell her the very moment she, i.e. the friend, was getting bored or frustrated or repelled. The depressed person knew perfectly well, of course, she assured the therapist, how such a request could all too possibly be heard not as an invitation to get off the telephone at will, but actually as a needy, manipulative plea not to get off, never to get off the telephone. So she pretends to care about her friend's time, but as she's well aware, really she's just getting them to stay on the telephone longer, and manipulation is another narcissistic trait. As Dr. Yackley puts it, narcissists are distinguished by a preoccupation with satisfying their own needs at the expense of the consideration of others. The depressed person's therapist, like any good therapist would, tries to break her out of this cycle of self-criticism and manipulation. The therapist, who by this time had less than a year to live, said that she felt she could support the depressed person's use of the word vulnerable more wholeheartedly than she could support the use of the word pathetic. Notice how the impending death of the therapist just slips right by. Blah, blah, blah. The therapist, who by this time had less than a year to live. When the therapist does die, and we learn it was almost certainly a suicide, the depressed person feels abandoned. Then she goes into meta-self-loathing and feels worried about the fact that she's feeling sorry for herself and not for her therapist. Although she had had agonizing feelings aplenty since the therapist's suicide, these feelings appeared to be all and only for herself, i.e., for her loss, her abandonment, her grief, her trauma. And then she goes into the fourth dimension of navel gazing and calls her friend to say that even though she realizes all of this, she's not changing her emotional reaction to her therapist's death, and that also makes her feel bad about herself. This terrifying set of realizations, instead of awakening in her any feelings of compassion, empathy, or other directed grief for the therapist, and here the depressed person waited patiently for an episode of retching in the especially available trusted friend to pass so that she could take the emotional risk of sharing this with her. These realizations seemed merely to have brought up in the depressed person still more feelings about herself. The kicker is, this friend is incredibly ill. She is dying from cancer, a virulent neuroblastoma. And here the depressed person waited patiently for an episode of retching in the especially available trusted friend to pass, so that she could continue complaining about what a selfish person she is. And this is the big one, right? The depressed person is showing a lack of empathy here that is hard for most of us to even imagine. It's not even a lack of sympathy, right? Sympathy is a different animal. Sympathy is feeling bad for a person, for example. Empathy is simply the ability to register what is going on with other people. And the depressed person is just too blinkered to do that. Is the depressed person really depressed? Or is she a narcissist who's using depression to get sympathy and attention? Or is it both and one just reinforces the other in a misery vortex? I mean, yeah, she certainly displays symptoms of narcissism to a degree that I would say is, clinically significant. So more than your run-of-the-mill somewhat narcissistic person. But that doesn't necessarily mean her depression isn't real either. Her subjective accounts of pain and depression shouldn't be completely discounted. Depression is comorbid with narcissism, especially with covert narcissism. And there are studies that show that depression can make you less empathetic because you are sort of inwardly focused. The most important part that indicates that she might truly be depressed is rumination. Rumination is a way of thinking that is basically a trademark of depressive cognition. It's when you just dwell on the same problem and mull it over and over in your mind. The word rumination comes from the way cows eat, where they chew their cud super slowly and then swallow it and then regurgitate it and chew it all over again. And the depressed person, we see that she thinks this way a lot. All the lines she says, we're led to understand that she's said them already a million times before. Here, she nearly always inserted that her therapist concurred. The depressed person always apologized. The depressed person always took care. She actually repeats certain sentences over and over with slight variations. For example, she constantly worries that she is taking her friends' time away from their active, vibrant, largely pain-free, long-distance lives, vibrant, stimulating careers, full, vibrant, undepressed life, and healthy and joyful sexual intimacy with their partner. What this story does absolutely brilliantly is two things. First of all, it shows us how both depression and narcissism lock you into this inescapable U-box, where you are just with yourself all the time. This sort of endless mental dance around herself that the depressed person is stuck in, it's at the core of this story, and it's in everything. I mean, it's in the first line, right? It's pain that is reinforced by the fact that it's impossible to express. It's also in the way everything the depressed person sees, she immediately refers back to herself. To the point where even her therapist's fingernails, she notices the fingernails, they're well manicured. She thinks, oh, mine are ragged and bitten. And then another one with the therapist's hands, weirdly, is that the depressed person sees a symbolism in the way the therapist arranges her hands when in session. Placing the tips of all her fingers together in her lap and manipulating them idly as she listened supportively so that her mated hands formed various enclosing shapes, e.g. cube, sphere, cone. And to the depressed person, it seemed like her hands were forming various geometrically diverse cages. This story to me is like a snake eating its own tail wrote a story about another snake eating its own tail. These circular loops that the story is built around, they loop the reader in too, or at least they certainly loop me in. And that's the second brilliant thing to me. The depressed person is like if David Foster Wallace took all my worst qualities and just isolated them into a single character. She's like my personal Mr. Hyde. In my early 20s, the topics that, I would constantly be thinking about: is my depression real? What do I have to be sad about? Am I actually just a narcissist? Does my therapist know I'm a narcissist? Or is it my depression telling me that I'm a narcissist to give me another reason to hate myself? And can everyone see what I see in myself? Can everyone see what a pathetic loser I am? As you might notice, what these thoughts have in common is they're all about me. Feelings of inadequacy and shame and self-loathing can stem both from depression and from narcissism, and one can reinforce the other. Hating yourself, counterintuitively, in my opinion, does not make you a better person, right? You'd think if you're constantly criticizing yourself, you're sort of moving towards becoming better. I think anyone who criticizes themselves a lot knows that that is not the case at all. And being self-aware, terrifyingly, also doesn't make you a better person. Just like the depressed person knows how she's supposed to be acting, that absolutely doesn't make her act that way. Being more self-aware doesn't mean being happier. You can know everything that's wrong with you, and you can know what you need to do to be happier and still not act on it. I honestly think that another layer of this story is just Wallace throwing shade at therapy. However, the depressed person herself is kind of a dead-end case, clearly. She doesn't get anywhere in this story, but most of us aren't her. We know that in most cases, depression is quite treatable. Big fan of Searchline. It's a common opinion that narcissism, unlike depression, isn't treatable. But the idea that narcissists as a whole can't change is false. In his book, Rethinking Narcissism, Dr. Craig Malkin writes, "Stripped down to its basic action, narcissism is a learned response, that is, a habit, and like any habit, it gets stronger or weaker depending on circumstances. More than a dozen studies exploring whether or not narcissists can change have now been conducted, and they all point to the same conclusion: encouraging narcissists to feel more caring and compassionate reduces their narcissism." One of the most insidious things about both narcissism and depression is the way they lock you into your U-box. And the key, I suppose, is just to break this cycle of self-loathing, break the cycle of staring at yourself in the lake and look around. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe so as not to miss the next video, and consider becoming a patron. And here are some lovely people who have done so.